So, what I'd like to talk about today is a topic that's perhaps very relevant in light of the events that we've just seen. A lot of people are interpreting what happened with the vote, the Brexit vote, as some sort of protest vote that households have had that have felt left out of the process of globalization. And I think that there's something to this. In particular, one of the great benefits of globalization is the ability to invest in assets all around the world and gain very high rates of return on them. And if you don't have levels of education and wealth that allow you to think about these things and understand why it's important, or whether you have an issue of trust in financial markets, then what's going to happen is the people at the bottom of the pyramid don't invest at the same rates of return as the people at the top of the pyramid. And through that channel alone, you can get very large differences between their rates of growth and wealth, and then that generates more income inequality going forward. So one of the things that many of us have been thinking about, and this has perhaps been made most popular by the work of Thomas Piketty that you've probably seen with Capital in the 21st Century, which was an absolutely fantastic book. But many of us are working in this area of what's called household finance, which is to understand the causes and consequences of households making very complicated decisions that sometimes they're not equipped to make very well on how to allocate their savings, how to pick mortgages, how to take short-term consumer credit. So it isn't just households that we're talking about that are at the very bottom of the pyramid, those that have microfinance issues or are dealing with unscrupulous lenders that we're talking about, but we're also talking about those that have just entered formal financial markets for the first time and are struggling with the fact that they sometimes have to deal with problems that take people many, many months to solve sometimes, and often take hours and hours for sophisticated computers to try to process solutions to complex problems. So what I want to do today is to give you a little bit of a flavor of the kind of work that we've been doing in household finance, and I want to focus on a country that's dear to my heart for obvious reasons, which is India. But before I get into India, I just want to show you some very simple statistics that kind of represent the scale of this problem. And while I'm not going to talk about debt today in the form of mortgages, that's very important, I'm going to talk about the asset side of the typical household balance sheet, which involves how you allocate your savings. So here's a graph that basically shows you how household assets are allocated along the wealth distribution. So if you look along the horizontal axis, what this does is it sorts households in every country by their place in the wealth distribution. So in other words, the households at the very bottom are those at the bottom 10th percentile of the wealth distribution in their countries. And then as you move up, the households at the very top, most of whom are in this room, are in the 9th and 10th distribution, in the deciles of the wealth distribution. And what this also does on the vertical axis is it shows you what fraction of those people at each point in the wealth distribution actually invest in what are known as risky assets. Okay? So a risky asset might be an investment in the stock market, it might be an investment in bonds, anything that basically has some kind of formal financial aspect to it where you're actually participating in a market. Now, you'll see multiple lines along there, and each one of those lines represents a different country. So this plot is a little complicated, so let me try and explain it a little bit better. So what this shows you is, obviously, for the households at the very bottom of the wealth distribution, they don't have a lot of wealth available to invest, so in fact their allocation to risky assets is extremely small. Okay? Now I should point out that economic theory has been hammering on for years about the fact that any household with even a tiny bit of discretionary income should be taking that discretionary income and parking it in savings that have a positive expected rate of return. So economic theory will tell you, and you can prove this, that actually people should be putting some money in these assets. But the staggering thing is, as you move along the wealth distribution, even for people who have the ability to do this, there's very little participation in risky assets. And even when you move up to the very top of the wealth distribution, there's still a number of excluded households at the very top end of the wealth distribution. The second thing to notice from this graph is that the pattern is not uniform across countries. While the trends are very similar, you can see huge differences between Spain at the very bottom and Canada and the US at the very top. So it seems like there are some puzzling differences here that can't just be explained by the growth in wealth of these households, that there are things that are cultural factors, presumably, that affect the differences across countries and the extent of penetration of formal financial markets. Let's now turn to the topic that's a little bit closer to my heart, which is really emerging economies that have many, many people coming into formal financial markets who are just not equipped to deal with the decisions that they're making, the complex decisions that they're making. And we're talking about a growth of these kinds of people that is extraordinary, okay? So we're looking at people at a rate of 7.5% or 8% economic growth. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people a day who are basically having to make very complicated decisions that they've never made before. So if I look at India in relation to the rest of the world, what you'll see is here, if I look at the proportion of assets, and this is of the people who are actually participating in formal financial markets, so this is actually leaving out those that are not participating, but even if I look at the people who are, and if I stare into their balance sheets, I'm looking at the percent of their balance sheets that's allocated to different assets. And you'll notice that in India and China, the very largest fraction of asset holdings is in real estate. And this seems pretty obvious. People should be wanting to invest in real estate, you might think. But the point is that if you have an efficiently functioning rental market, maybe you don't need to pledge a huge amount of financial wealth to go into real estate. So that's kind of problem number one. But problem number two is even the tiny bit of discretionary assets that they have available after tying up their assets in real estate is not always allocated to formal financial assets. Perhaps the most striking pattern here is that in India and China, households aren't investing anything at all in retirement assets. And this is a serious problem for households that are going to be facing retirement coming up in about 30, 40 years and are completely unprepared for this. And so the governments in these countries are perhaps not going to really face the full scale of this problem until 25 years down the road. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that there's an investment in durable goods there. And this is really the bit that we're going to stare into a little bit more carefully. So durable goods in the US usually involve things like an automobile or a refrigerator or things like that. In India, when you look inside that fraction which is in durable goods, which is a not insubstantial fraction, what you'll see is that the vast majority of that is gold. Now, the problem with having gold, if you're going to invest in anything, is that it is perhaps the world's most unproductive asset that you can possibly imagine. Now, it is absolutely true that for people who are higher up in the wealth distribution, of course it provides some utility. It's a wonderful thing to have. You might think that it has some safe haven properties, but if you're a household at the very bottom of the wealth distribution, you're not really worried so much about insurance during crises and the return to gold. You're worried about deploying your assets on a day-to-day basis so it generates a productive rate of return. And even if you think that it's $100 a year or $200 a year, which we might not think is a lot, it's going to help dramatically in alleviating wealth constraints for these households on an ongoing basis. So the question is, what explains this lure of gold? And so what we did was, we went to the household survey data, and we tried to understand a little bit more about what explained gold. Now, there's one thing that sort of emerges from household finance research, and before I explain this graph, I just want to tell you about what that is, which is one of the things that we know when we try and explain the share of bad decisions that households make. And when I say bad decisions, I mean taking a canonical economist's perspective about what is the right thing to do. So if I look at any deviations between what households actually do and what an economist might think they should do or ought to do given their circumstances, that would be what I'd call an investment mistake. So the question is, what explains investment mistakes for households? Turns out that if you start thinking about the attributes of households and you put an investment mistake and try and sort of explain that using these household attributes, the things that you might expect come up. Households with lower levels of education make worse investment mistakes. Households at the very bottom of the spectrum of the wealth distribution make worse investment mistakes. Households in racial minorities make worse investment mistakes. You might ask the question, is that correlated with education? If it isn't, you might think that there's a supply problem, which is that in some cases they're being discriminated against. So there's all kinds of these attributes that come up. that you might think, okay, now there's a role here for trying to do something about this. Maybe we can improve education, maybe we can improve their wealth, we can do all of these sorts of things and try to make things better. But it turns out that even after you take away all of those things, and think about the fact that if I have to improve education, we're talking about a very long-term solution. It's going to take 3 to 5 years to really get households to participate. It's also the case, kind of worryingly, given the fact that I'm in the education business, that the evidence from household finance is that there's very little evidence that any financial education actually makes any difference to households at all. I wish I could tell you different, but the answer is it's really, really hard to do this stuff. The only thing that's been shown to work is video games. Gamification works quite a bit. Okay, so don't tell your children that. We're trying to keep our son away from video games as much as we possibly can. So what we did was we stripped out all of those explanatory factors, and then we tried to explain the unexplained variation. And what we did to begin with is just plotted this across the distribution of Indian states. So what this plot shows you is what is the residual gold holdings ratio after you've stripped out all of the demographic effects and all of the characteristic effects. And the answer is, if you actually look at these households, these names are not going to mean very much to you, but if you look at the identities of those states, the states at the very top of the list over there are, very many of them, the vast majority of them, are in South India. And it turns out that in South India, there's a very strong cultural bias towards holding gold. And there has been historically for generations. There's many jewelers around. During weddings, it is customary to give and receive huge amounts of presents of gold. In fact, if I interact the number of daughters in a household, because dowry is still a tradition that goes on, with the state identity, you get enormous explanatory power, telling you that some of these customs and cultural reasons are actually causing households to overallocate to things like gold. Now, that's worrying for lots of reasons, but it's also quite heartening for other reasons because it tells you that if there are behavioral biases or cultural biases that cause households to make bad decisions, they might actually be easier to deal with and fix than problems like income, education, and wealth, which take huge amounts of time to fix. So continuing with that exploration, we said, look, can we try to explain this also using something slightly different, which is maybe households are actually, for standard financial reasons, thinking about investing in gold because they believe that gold is an inflation hedge. So what we did was we got state-level inflation for each one of these countries over a long period of time. And the nice thing about having a country like India to look at is that it's got enormous geographical diversity, and it's also got diversity in the way that the markets work in India. Okay? So unlike the European Union, India is not an integrated market at all, believe it or not. In fact, the states of India are about as unintegrated as you can get while still remaining one contiguous nation. And so what we did is we got state-level inflation, which varies a lot, and then we just tried to correlate that with these residual levels of gold holdings. And what we found was this very, very interesting relationship. If you look along the horizontal axis tells you about the experience over 20 years of the volatility of inflation in each state. In other words, sometimes inflation is running at 5%, and other times at -1%. And that might be much more volatile than a state in which inflation is running, say, at 1% for quite a period of time, and then after that maybe runs at 0.5% afterwards. And if you look at the gold holdings ratio, you see this very nice explanatory power for this stuff. And what this basically tells you is that there are very long-lasting effects of these kinds of economic shocks on households. When they see lots of inflation volatility, they basically start turning towards things like gold, and they hang on to them for long periods of time. So I guess we don't have all of the answers. I mean, you never do. But the things that we're starting to uncover using these techniques and sort of thinking a little bit harder about the microeconomic motivations of households is that it's not just the usual instruments that you might use for economic policy to promote good outcomes. There are other things that you might be able to do, like looking a little bit harder into the psychological and behavioral underpinnings of why households make bad decisions and trying to come up with ways to help them through that process, whether it be assuaging their fears, their behavioral fears about what might be going on, or indeed thinking about the cultural factors that we might be able to unwind and help households make better decisions. So, and go Williams.